I've kept a secret for 60 years. Not the kind that involves classified documents or political scandals. I've reported on plenty of those. This secret is quieter, more personal. It's about a woman the whole world thought they knew, and a conversation that lasted barely 20 minutes, but changed how I understood everything about fame, loneliness, and the stories we tell ourselves about the people we worship from afar. Her name was Marilyn Monroe. And on a humid August evening in 1954, in a cramped dressing room that smelled of powder and desperation, she told me something I've never repeated to another living soul until now. The summer of 1954 was different in New York City. The war had been over for nearly a decade, and America was drunk on its own success. Television sets were multiplying in living rooms across the country, and we in the news business were still trying to figure out what this new medium meant for journalism. I was 37 years old, working as a correspondent for CBS, still hungry, still believing that a good story could change the world. The newsroom on Madison Avenue had that particular energy of a place where important things happened. Typewriters clattered like machine guns. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Everyone smoked then, constantly, as if oxygen itself wasn't quite enough to keep us going. Phones rang with the urgency of a world that never stopped turning. I loved it. The chaos, the deadline pressure, the sense that we were witnessing history and writing its first draft. My editor, a gruff man named Harrison, who wore the same brown suit every day, called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the date because it was my wedding anniversary and I'd already made reservations at a French restaurant my wife had been wanting to try. Monroe's doing a press junket for There's No Business Like Show Business, Harrison said, not looking up from the copy he was editing with a thick red pencil. Studio wants someone serious, not the entertainment boys, someone who'll ask real questions. I told them I'd send you. I must have made a face because Harrison finally looked up, one eyebrow raised in that way that suggested disagreement would be futile. It's a fluff piece, I protested. Why not send? Because everyone thinks it's a fluff piece, Harrison interrupted. That's exactly why it is. You're a reporter, aren't you? So report. Find the person under all that platinum hair and lipstick. I've got a feeling there's a real story there if someone bothers to look. That was Harrison's gift. He could smell a story the way some men could predict rain. I canceled dinner reservations and accepted the assignment, though I'll admit I did so with a certain professional snobbery. Movie stars weren't news, I thought. They were entertainment, distraction, gossip column fodder. I had no idea how wrong I was. The summer of 1954 was different in New York City. The war had been over for nearly a decade, and America was drunk on its own success. Television sets were multiplying in living rooms across the country, and we in the news business were still trying to figure out what this new medium meant for journalism. I was 37 years old, working as a correspondent for CBS, still hungry, still believing that a good story could change the world. The newsroom on Madison Avenue had that particular energy of a place where important things happened. Typewriters clattered like machine guns. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Everyone smoked then, constantly, as if oxygen itself wasn't quite enough to keep us going. Phones rang with the urgency of a world that never stopped turning. I loved it. The chaos, the deadline pressure, the sense that we were witnessing history and writing its first draft. My editor, a gruff man named Harrison, who wore the same brown suit every day, called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the date because it was my wedding anniversary, and I'd already made reservations at a French restaurant my wife had been wanting to try. Monroe's doing a press junket for There's No Business Like Show Business, Harrison said, not looking up from the copy he was editing with a thick red pencil. Studio wants someone serious, not the entertainment boys. Someone who'll ask real questions. I told them I'd send you. I must have made a face because Harrison finally looked up, one eyebrow raised in that way that suggested disagreement would be futile. It's a fluff piece. I protested. Why not send? Because everyone thinks it's a fluff piece, Harrison interrupted. That's exactly why it isn't. You're a reporter, aren't you? So report. Find the person under all that platinum hair and lipstick. I've got a feeling there's a real story there, if someone bothers to look. That was Harrison's gift. He could smell a story the way some men could predict rain. I canceled dinner reservations and accepted the assignment, though I'll admit I did so with a certain professional snobbery. Movie stars weren't news, I thought. They were entertainment, distraction, gossip column fodder. I had no idea how wrong I was. The performance stopped. It was that immediate. One moment she was Marilyn Monroe, movie star, and the next she was someone else entirely. The shift was so abrupt it was almost frightening. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since I'd entered the room. "That's not a question anyone's asked me before," she said quietly. I waited. In journalism, as in life, sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply wait. She moved to the window, her back to me again, looking down at the New York streets where people moved like ants, each absorbed in their own small dramas, unaware that 30 floors above them sat a woman whose face appeared on billboards and magazine covers across the world. "I'm lonely every day," she said, "even when I'm surrounded by people, especially then." I should have started taking notes. That's what a good reporter would have done, but I didn't. I just listened. "You know what's funny," she continued, and there was no humor in her voice. "Everyone thinks they know me. They see me on screen and they think, that's Marilyn. But that's not me. That's this thing I created, this character. And she's very good at her job. She smiles and laughs and makes men feel like they're the only man in the world when she looks at them. But me, the person under all that, nobody wants to meet her. She's not nearly as much fun." She turned back to face me, and in that moment, with the golden light behind her and shadows across her face, I saw something that the camera never captured. Fear. Deep, existential fear. "Do you know what it's like," she asked, "to be famous for your body but not trusted with your mind? To have everyone want to sleep with you but nobody want to have a conversation with you? They put me in these movies where I play the dumb blonde and I do it well. I'm a good actress, whatever the critics say, but then everyone assumes that's all I am. Even the studio executives who've known me for years talk to me like I'm a child." She sat down on the sofa, suddenly looking exhausted. "I read Mr. Cronkite. I read Dostoevsky and Hemingway. I study acting with real passion. I want to do serious work, to play serious roles. But nobody will let me. They've decided who Marilyn Monroe is, and I'm trapped inside her." The bourbon glass was empty. She looked at it as if surprised to find it so. "I tried to talk to my husband about this," she said. Joe DiMaggio had been her husband for barely 6 months at that point, though I didn't know then that the marriage was already crumbling. But even he doesn't understand. He wants me to quit, to be a housewife, as if that would solve anything, as if I could just stop being Marilyn Monroe by changing my address. I found my voice. "What would you do if you could do anything?" She smiled, but it was sad, far away. "I'd disappear. Go somewhere nobody knows me. Read books. Take long walks. Have real conversations with real people who see me as a person, not as this." She gestured vaguely at herself, at the body that had made her fortune and become her prison. "But I can't," she continued, "because Marilyn Monroe is all I have. Without her, I'm just Norma Jean, and Norma Jean never had anything. Norma Jean was nobody. She grew up in foster homes. She was unwanted. Marilyn Monroe is wanted. Maybe too much, but at least she's wanted. And I'm terrified that if I let her go, I'll disappear too." There was a knock at the door. The publicist's voice. "5 minutes, Miss Monroe?" Marilyn's expression changed instantly. It was like watching an actress step back into character, except it happened in reverse. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by that practiced, glittering smile. But before she could fully transform, she did something unexpected. She crossed the room to where I sat, leaned down, and spoke very quietly, very quickly, as if afraid she might lose her nerve. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to promise you won't print it. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I need to tell someone who will remember it correctly in case someday it matters." I nodded, knowing I was abandoning my role as a journalist, but unable to refuse. "I'm afraid all the time," she whispered. "Afraid I'm not good enough, not smart enough, not real enough. Afraid that everyone will eventually figure out that Marilyn Monroe is just smoke and mirrors, that there's nothing substantial underneath. And I'm most afraid that they're right, that I've spent so much time being this invented person that I've lost whoever I really was, if I was ever anyone at all." She straightened up, and now the tears that had been threatening were visible. Real tears, nothing performed about them. "The worst part is, I can't even trust my own emotions anymore. When I cry, I wonder if I'm really crying or if I'm just playing a role I've rehearsed 1,000 times. When I laugh, is it genuine or is it Marilyn laughing? I don't know the difference anymore. I'm not sure there is a difference." The knock came again, more insistent. "I should go," I said, standing up. "Thank you," she said, "for listening, for not taking notes, for treating me like a person instead of a headline. I was at the door when she spoke once more. Mr. Cronkite, when you write about this interview, and I know you have to write something, would you do me a favor? Don't make me sound pathetic. I'm not asking for pity. I'm not asking for pity. I'm not asking for pity. I was this life. I fought hard for it. I just wish she trailed off. Then tried again. I just wish being a symbol didn't require you to stop being a person. I wrote my article on the train home that night. It was professional, respectable, exactly what the studio would have approved. I mentioned her upcoming film, her beauty, her ambitions to be taken seriously as an actress. I left out everything that mattered. When I got home, my wife was already asleep. I sat in my study for a long time thinking about Marilyn Monroe and what it costs to be the thing everyone wants you to be. I thought about the difference between privacy and loneliness, between fame and connection, between the self we show the world and the self we hide even from ourselves. I never interviewed her again. 8 years later, in August of 1962, I was the one who had to report her death on the evening news. I remember sitting at that desk, looking at the camera and thinking about those 20 minutes in a hotel suite when America's most famous sex symbol had revealed herself to be exactly what everyone should have known she was all along. A frightened, lonely, brilliant woman who'd been given the whole world's attention, but none of its understanding. I've been a reporter for my entire adult life. I've interviewed presidents and criminals, heroes and cowards, the powerful and the powerless. But that conversation with Marilyn Monroe taught me something I've never forgotten. The stories we tell about people, especially famous people, are almost always wrong. Not because we lie, but because we prefer the mythology to the truth. The mythology is simpler, more satisfying, easier to digest. Marilyn Monroe, the mythology, was a blonde bombshell, a sex symbol, a troubled starlet who couldn't handle fame. She was a cautionary tale about beauty and excess, about Hollywood's cruelty, about the dangers of wanting too much and achieving it too fast. But Marilyn Monroe, the person, was someone else. She was intelligent and fearful, ambitious and insecure, desperate to be taken seriously while trapped in a cage of her own making. She was someone who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that you could be known by millions and understood by no one. I think about that conversation often, especially now in my old age, when I look back on the thousands of stories I've covered and try to understand what any of it meant. What strikes me is how much we ask of our celebrity. We demand that they be perfect and fallible, confident and humble, available and mysterious. We want them to be larger than life while punishing them for any reminder that they're human. And then we act surprised when the weight of our expectations crushes them. Marilyn knew this. She lived it every day. And on that August evening in 1954, she tried to tell me, tried to make me understand what it was like to be the most desired woman in the world and still go home to an empty bed and an empty heart. I didn't print what she told me because she asked me not to, and because some truths are too raw, too vulnerable to be turned into headlines. But I've thought about publishing it 1,000 times over the years, especially after her death, when the mythology around her grew even larger and more distorted. Perhaps I'm telling it now because I'm old enough that keeping secrets seems less important than honoring truth. Or perhaps it's because I think we need to remember that behind every famous face, every public persona, every carefully constructed image, there's a person. A real person with real fears and real pain and real dreams that have nothing to do with how we've decided to see them. The last time I saw Marilyn's face, it was in a photograph in a newspaper accompanying the story of her death. She was smiling, that famous smile, the one that launched 1,000 fantasies. But I looked at that photograph differently than most people did. I looked at it and saw a woman who'd told me in a moment of desperate honesty that she'd lost herself in the process of becoming everyone's dream. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine an alternate version of that evening. In this version, when Marilyn asks if I ever get lonely, I tell her the truth. I tell her, yes, yes, I get lonely, lonely in crowds, lonely in my own home, lonely in the space between who I am and who I'm supposed to be. I tell her that everyone feels this way sometimes, that the human condition is one of fundamental isolation, briefly interrupted by moments of genuine connection. And maybe in this alternate version, that moment of shared honesty would have helped her. Maybe it would have made her feel less alone, less broken, less like a fraud who'd somehow fooled the entire world. But I didn't say any of that. I stayed professional, kept my distance, maintained the barrier between reporter and subject that I'd been trained to preserve. That's my secret, the one I've carried for 60 years. Not what Marilyn told me, but what I failed to tell her, that she wasn't alone in her loneliness. that the disconnection between public self and private self isn't unique to movie stars, that everyone in their own way is performing a version of themselves they hope the world will accept. I'm an old man now. I've reported on wars and elections, on triumphs and disasters, on the great sweeping changes that have transformed our world. But the story that haunts me most is the one I never told. The story of a woman in a hotel room backlit by golden August sun, asking a question nobody else had bothered to ask her in return. She wanted to be seen, really seen, not as Marilyn Monroe, a movie star, but as a person complicated and contradictory and fully human. And for 20 minutes in that room, I saw her. I really did. I just wish I'd told her so. The bourbon glass she held that day, did I mention she set it down on a table by the window? I noticed as I left that it had left a ring on the polished wood, a small imperfection in an otherwise perfect room. The publicist would probably have someone remove it before the next interview, but I like to think it stayed there, at least for a little while. A small, invisible evidence that Marilyn Monroe had been there, that she'd been real, that she'd existed as more than just light on celluloid and ink on paper, that she'd been for just a moment exactly what she wanted to be.